Milledgeville, Georgia, 1998. Sarah Mitchell had been a psychiatric nurse for 12 years, working in various facilities across the state, but nothing in her extensive career prepared her for what she would experience during her first night shift at Central State Hospital's abandoned Powell building. The facility, once holding the distinction of being the largest mental institution in the entire world, had been slowly and methodically shutting down its older buildings since the mid-1960s, leaving entire wings and floors to rot and decay in the oppressive, suffocating Georgia humidity that seemed to accelerate the deterioration of everything it touched. Sarah wasn't supposed to be in the Powell building at all that night. The massive structure had been officially condemned for 5 years, its thousands of patient records carefully moved to newer facilities, its beds stripped and emptied, its long corridors and treatment rooms declared structurally unsafe by state inspectors, who had documented extensive water damage, black mold, and foundations weakened by decades of neglect. But on that particularly cold October night, her supervisor handed her a clipboard with a detailed checklist and a heavy-duty flashlight with an unusual and somewhat suspicious request that immediately made Sarah uncomfortable. "We need documentation that certain equipment was removed before the demolition," her supervisor explained in a rushed tone, deliberately avoiding direct eye contact with Sarah in a way that suggested there was more to this story than she was being told. "The fire marshal wants photographic proof and a signed inventory before they authorize the demolition crew to move forward next month. Just walk through each floor, check off the items on the list, take clear photos of each room, and you'll be done in about an hour. 2 hours maximum if you're thorough." Something in her supervisor's tone, the way her voice wavered slightly on certain words, made Sarah's stomach tighten with apprehension and unease. But she desperately needed this job. Her daughter Emma's mounting medical bills from a chronic condition weren't going to pay themselves, and jobs with decent insurance coverage were hard to come by in rural Georgia. The overtime pay for this unusual assignment would cover at least 2 months of prescriptions. So at precisely 11:47 p.m., after signing the liability waiver her supervisor had suddenly produced, Sarah pushed open the heavy steel door of the Powell building and stepped into a darkness so complete and absolute that it seemed to actively swallow her flashlight beam, as if the shadows themselves were hungry for any trace of illumination. The smell hit her first, before her eyes had even fully adjusted to the oppressive darkness. A nauseating, stomach-churning cocktail of mildew, advanced decay, standing water, and something else, something organic and fundamentally wrong that she couldn't quite identify, but that triggered every primitive warning signal her brain possessed. Her footsteps echoed loudly off cracked tile floors as she moved carefully through the entrance hall, methodically checking off items on her inventory list with growing unease. Gurney frames, still present and accounted for, their wheels rusted solid. Medication cabinets, empty and hanging open, their glass fronts shattered. Restraint equipment, supposedly removed according to the records, though she could still see mounting brackets on several walls. Everything matched the official inventory documentation until she reached the 3rd floor, where the discrepancies began. The stairwell door opened with a prolonged, ear-piercing shriek of rusted hinges that made Sarah jump violently, her heart suddenly pounding in her chest. Her flashlight flickered once, twice, then 3 times in rapid succession before steadying, though the beam seemed noticeably weaker than it had been just moments before. She made a mental note to check the batteries, though she'd installed fresh ones before entering the building. The 3rd floor had housed the most severe and dangerous cases, according to the records she'd briefly reviewed. Patients deemed too violent, too unpredictable, or too resistant to treatment for the general population wards. Thick metal doors with small reinforced observation windows lined both sides of the corridor, each one hanging open at odd, unnatural angles that suggested either tremendous force or deliberate vandalism, revealing the deteriorating padded cells beyond. Sarah checked her watch in the flashlight beam, 12:23 a.m. She wanted desperately to finish this floor as quickly as possible and get out of this oppressive claustrophobic building that seemed to press in on her from all sides. As she moved cautiously down the hallway, carefully documenting each empty room with photos and check marks, she became increasingly aware of a sound beneath her own footsteps and breathing. At first, she told herself it was just the building settling, that familiar creak and groan of old structures, responding to temperature changes and the constant pressure of their own weight. But then she realized with growing horror that the sound had rhythm, had intention, had melody. Someone or something was humming a tune. She froze completely, every muscle in her body tensing, her breath catching painfully in her throat. The humming was definitely coming from the end of the corridor, from a room marked Isolation 7 in faded, barely legible paint. It was a child's tune, something hauntingly familiar but distorted somehow, played in a minor key that made her skin crawl and her hair stand on end. Sarah knew with absolute certainty that she should leave immediately. Every instinct, every survival mechanism honed by millions of years of evolution screamed at her to turn around and run as fast as her legs could carry her. But her feet carried her forward instead, drawn by a compulsion she couldn't name or understand, as if invisible strings were pulling her toward that room. The door to Isolation 7 stood partially open, just wide enough for a person to slip through. Through the gap, her weakening flashlight revealed what appeared to be an empty room, its padded walls torn and hanging in long strips like dead skin, revealing the stained concrete beneath, covered in what looked like scratch marks and stains she preferred not to examine too closely. The humming stopped abruptly, cut off mid-note. In the sudden oppressive silence, Sarah heard her own heartbeat thundering in her ears, so loud she was certain it could be heard throughout the entire floor. Then a voice, clear as crystal and terrifyingly calm, spoke from inside the supposedly empty room. "Nurse Sarah Mitchell, we've been waiting such a very long time for you to finally arrive." The voice knew her full name. The voice had been expecting her specifically. Sarah's flashlight fell from her suddenly nerveless hand, the beam rolling in crazy, disorienting circles across the filthy floor, creating dancing shadows that seemed to move with purpose and malice. She stumbled backwards, her hands scrabbling against the wall for support, and that's when she saw them with crystal clarity. In each doorway she'd passed, in each cell she'd carefully documented as empty just moments ago, figures now stood motionless. Patients in hospital gowns from another era, the fabric style dating back to the 1950s or earlier. Their faces completely blank and expressionless, their eyes reflecting her flashlight beam like animals caught on a dark country road at night. That same unnatural eye shine that suggested something fundamentally wrong with their biology. They didn't move toward her. They didn't speak or make any sound. They simply watched, with those terrible, reflecting eyes as Sarah ran, their heads turning in perfect unison to follow her progress down the hallway, tracking her movements in a precision that suggested a hive mind or shared consciousness. She hit the stairwell door at full speed, the impact bruising her shoulder, nearly falling down the stairs in her panic as her feet struggled to find purchase on steps that seemed to shift and move beneath her. Behind her, she heard them begin to follow. Not running, not rushing, just walking with measured institutional steps that seemed to come from every direction at once, above her and below her and beside her, as if the building itself had become filled with their presence. Sarah burst out of the Powell building and into her car, her hands shaking so violently she could barely get the key in the ignition, dropping them twice before finally succeeding. As she pulled away with squealing tires, she looked back at the massive, looming structure of the Powell building silhouetted against the night sky. Every single window on the third floor was filled with a figure, dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, all standing perfectly still in that same eerie uniformity, all watching her leave with those reflecting eyes that caught her headlights as she turned the car around. She drove straight to the Milledgeville police station, where 2 officers on night duty listened to her story with barely concealed skepticism written clearly across their faces, exchanging meaningful glances that suggested they thought she was either intoxicated or experiencing some kind of mental health crisis. But the genuine terror in her voice and her visible physical state, scraped hands, bruised shoulder, pupils dilated with adrenaline, convinced them to at least check the building with her present. However, when they arrived to the Powell building approximately 30 minutes later, they found the main steel door chained and padlocked from the outside, with a heavy-duty lock covered in rust and clearly undisturbed for years,
possibly decades. The key Sarah's supervisor had given her, which she produced from her pocket, didn't match any lock on the building and appeared to be for a completely different type of mechanism. More disturbing still, when they finally cut through the chain with bolt cutters and entered the Powell building with police-grade flashlights that illuminated the interior far better than Sarah's equipment had, they found the third-floor stairwell door welded completely shut with professional-grade welds, a modification that maintenance records indicated had been made in 1987 as part of the facility's downsizing process. There was no possible way Sarah could have accessed that floor, no way she could have walked those corridors or seen those rooms. The physical evidence contradicted her entire account. Sarah quit her job the very next day, not even calling, simply leaving a brief resignation letter on her supervisor's desk. She never returned to Central State Hospital, never picked up her final paycheck, never collected her personal belongings from her locker. She wanted nothing more to do with that place or anyone associated with it. But the story doesn't end there, because reality has a way of refusing to let go. 2 weeks after her terrifying experience, her supervisor disappeared without explanation. Her car was found in the hospital parking lot, keys still in the ignition, driver's door standing open, purse and cell phone on the passenger seat, no signs of struggle or foul play. A comprehensive search of her office during the missing person investigation revealed dozens of clipboards stored in a locked filing cabinet, each one identical to the one she'd given Sarah, each one containing the same equipment inventory list, each one marked with different dates going back 7 years, each one signed by a different nurse, none of whom still worked at the facility. Most disturbing of all, investigators found a patient record that had been misfiled, hidden in a box of maintenance documents that should have been destroyed years ago. It belonged to a woman who had been institutionalized in 1952 after drowning her 3 children in a bathtub, claiming they were infected with demons and she was saving their souls. The patient's name, written in careful 1950s handwriting, was Sarah Mitchell. According to the detailed records, she had died in Isolation 7 in 1959 under suspicious circumstances after spending her final months telling doctors and orderlies that she was waiting for someone specific, that one day another Sarah Mitchell would come to the hospital, and when she did, she would finally understand what it meant to be trapped forever in the spaces between breathing and drowning, between madness and the terrible clarity that comes when you realize the walls of your mind are far more confining than any padded cell could ever be. The real Sarah Mitchell, the nurse, moved out of state shortly after the investigation concluded, relocating to Arizona, where the dry heat and endless sunshine felt like the opposite of Georgia's oppressive humidity and shadows. But she still receives letters, postmarked from Milledgeville, with no return address, arriving every few months with disturbing regularity. They're always the same: a single sheet of paper with a child's tune written in careful musical notation, and beneath it, in handwriting that matches the 1950s patient records, a simple message: "We're still waiting in Isolation 7. The third floor never really closes. And when you're ready to understand, when you're ready to accept what you are, we'll be here, humming your song, calling your name, waiting for you to come home to us."
North Georgia, 2003. The stretch of Route 129 between Cleveland and Helen is justifiably known throughout the region for its natural beauty. Winding mountain roads that test even experienced drivers, breathtaking views of the Chattahoochee National Forest stretching for miles in every direction, and numerous tourist attractions that draw thousands of visitors every year seeking the authentic mountain experience. But locals who have lived in the area for generations know to avoid a particular 15-mile section after dark. A seemingly ordinary piece of road where cell phones mysteriously lose all signal, GPS systems malfunction and display impossible locations, and travelers sometimes take a wrong turn into something that, by all laws of physics and reality, shouldn't exist at all. Marcus Webb learned this terrifying truth the hard way on a Friday night in November, a night that would fundamentally change his understanding of what was possible in the world. A successful software engineer from Atlanta with a rational, analytical mind that had always dismissed supernatural claims as superstition and fantasy, Marcus was driving to a professional conference in Asheville, North Carolina, where he was scheduled to deliver a presentation on emerging technologies. He'd left his office late, hoping to avoid the notorious Atlanta rush hour traffic, and found himself on Route 129 around 11 p.m., later than he'd intended, but still confident he'd reach his hotel before midnight. The night was moonless, one of those particularly dark November evenings where the sky seems to press down like a black ceiling. Fog was rolling down from the mountains in thick, impenetrable waves that his headlights barely penetrated, creating a claustrophobic tunnel of visibility that extended maybe 30 feet ahead of his vehicle at most. Marcus had driven this exact route dozens of times over the past 5 years, attending conferences and visiting clients throughout North Carolina and Tennessee. He knew every curve, every landmark, every gas station and rest stop along the way. But that night, something felt fundamentally different in a way he couldn't quite articulate. The usual landmarks seemed off, displaced, like someone had picked them up and moved them slightly to the left or right, just enough to trigger his subconscious sense that something was wrong. The 24-hour gas station that should have appeared at mile marker 47, the one where he always stopped for coffee, wasn't there, just empty road and dense forest pressing in from both sides. The well-marked turnoff for Helen, with its bright neon signs advertising German restaurants and tourist shops, came and went without him seeing any of the familiar illumination. His iPhone, which had shown full signal strength just minutes before entering this section of highway, now displayed the dreaded no service message. His expensive GPS system, which had never failed him in 3 years of ownership, displayed nothing but a blank screen with a single blinking cursor in the center, pulsing like a heartbeat. That's when he saw the hitchhiker standing at the side of the road, and everything that followed would test the boundaries of his rational worldview. She stood directly in the path of his headlights, clearly illuminated despite the fog. A young woman who appeared to be in her mid-20s, wearing faded jeans and a plain white t-shirt despite the November cold that had his car heater running at full blast. Her thumb was out in the universal gesture of hitchhiking, her expression desperate and pleading, her eyes reflecting his headlights with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. Against every bit of better judgment, against every warning his parents had given him about picking up strangers, Marcus pulled over onto the narrow shoulder. He would later tell police investigators and anyone else who would listen that he couldn't explain why he stopped, that it felt like his hands turned the wheel without his conscious permission, as if the car itself had decided to stop regardless of his intentions. "Thank God someone finally stopped," the woman said as she quickly climbed into his passenger seat, bringing with her a wave of warmth that seemed unnatural given the frigid temperature outside. "I've been trying to flag someone down for hours. My car broke down about 5 miles back on one of these side roads. My cell phone's completely dead, won't turn on at all. Can you give me a ride to the next town? Anywhere with a phone or a gas station would be perfect." Marcus agreed immediately, though something about her nagged at the edges of his consciousness, some detail his analytical mind couldn't quite process. Her clothes looked wrong somehow. The cut and fabric and even the style of the stitching dating from an earlier decade, maybe the 1980s based on the high waist of her jeans and the particular way her t-shirt was cut. And she was warm, unnaturally, impossibly warm. In a car that had just been flooded with frigid November air when she opened the door, air cold enough that Marcus could see his breath, she radiated heat like she'd been sitting in front of a roaring fire for hours. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the temperature. They drove in increasingly uncomfortable silence for several miles, the fog growing thicker if anything, reducing visibility to just a few feet. Marcus tried to make polite conversation, asking her name, where she was from, what she did for work, but her answers were vague and contradictory in ways that set off alarm bells in his methodical mind. She said her name was Jennifer, then 5 minutes later referred to herself as Jessica without seeming to notice the discrepancy. She claimed to be from Gainesville, then casually mentioned growing up in Athens and attending high school there. She said she was a teacher, then later mentioned working in a factory. Her stories didn't add up, the details constantly shifting and changing, but Marcus was too focused on navigating the treacherous, fog-shrouded road to press the issue or demand consistency. That's when he noticed with growing alarm that they were passing the same landmarks repeatedly, an impossibility that his rational mind struggled to accept. The same distinctly odd-shaped pine tree with a lightning-scarred trunk, the same weathered mailbox with a broken post tilting at precisely the same angle, the same sharp curve in the road where his headlights momentarily caught a deer's eyes glowing in the woods, the animal standing in exactly the same position each time. They'd been driving for what felt like 20 minutes at a steady 50 miles per hour, but according to his dashboard odometer, which he'd been watching with increasing anxiety, they'd only covered 3 miles. 3 miles that they seemed to be covering over and over again, trapped in some kind of impossible loop. "You need to turn around right now," the woman said suddenly, her voice taking on an urgent, almost desperate quality that made Marcus's hands tighten on the steering wheel. "You need to go back the way you came. You made a wrong turn somewhere back there, and if you keep going forward, if you keep following this road, you'll end up where I ended up, and trust me when I tell you that you'll never leave. None of us ever leave." Marcus glanced at her sharply, his attention divided dangerously between the road and his increasingly disturbing passenger, and in the green glow of his dashboard lights he saw that her face had changed dramatically. Her features remained technically the same eyes, same nose, same general structure, but something in her expression had shifted fundamentally, revealing a profound desperation, a terror so complete and soul-deep that it seemed to age her decades in seconds. The young woman who had climbed into his car now looked haunted, hollowed out as if something essential had been carved away from inside her. "What are you talking about?" Marcus demanded, his voice rising with barely controlled panic. "What wrong turn? What do you mean you never leave? I've driven this road 100 times and nothing like this has ever happened before." "The fog," she said, and her voice had taken on a distant, almost dreamlike quality, as if she was reciting something from memory, words she'd spoken many times before. "When you entered the fog bank about 20 minutes ago, you should have slowed down. Everyone who enters the fog at speed, everyone who doesn't respect it and approach it carefully, ends up on the loop. We just drive and drive, passing the same markers over and over again, burning the same gallon of gas repeatedly, watching the same 3 miles of road scroll past our windshields until our cars finally die from some mysterious mechanical failure and we join the others walking the roadside, trying to flag down the next driver, desperately hoping maybe we can warn them, maybe we can save one person from ending up like us, trapped forever in this impossible circle." Marcus slammed on his brakes hard, his car skidding slightly on the fog-slicked asphalt, before coming to a complete stop in the middle of the empty highway, his hazard lights clicking on automatically. He turned to look directly at his passenger, really look at her for the first time since she'd entered his vehicle, and in the sudden silence, punctuated only by his clicking hazard lights, he heard something that made his blood run cold and his skin break out in goosebumps. Other engines. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all running somewhere in the fog around him, invisible, but definitely present, all maintaining the same steady speed, all driving through the same 3 miles for reasons and durations he couldn't begin to imagine. "How long have you been here?" Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of those phantom engines. The woman smiled sadly, and in that smile, Marcus saw centuries of resignation, of hope gradually dying, of sanity slowly eroding under the weight of endless repetition. "I'm not sure anymore, if I'm being honest. Time works differently on the loop, you see. Sometimes it feels like I've only been here for days, that my car just broke down yesterday or maybe this morning. Sometimes it feels like I've been walking this roadside for years, decades even, watching the seasons change but never really changing myself. But when I check my phone, when I can remember that I have a phone, because sometimes I forget the most basic things, the date is always August 15th, 1987. That's the last real day I can remember with any clarity. After that, it's just the road and the fog and the same 3 miles over and over again, and the desperate hope that maybe the next driver will listen, will turn around, will escape before the loop sets its hooks in too deep to ever pull free." Marcus threw his car into reverse without another word and floored the accelerator, driving backwards on Route 129 at dangerous speeds that would have gotten him arrested under normal circumstances, not caring about other traffic or safety regulations, focused only on retracing his path exactly, on undoing whatever wrong turn had brought him to this impossible place. The woman in his passenger seat began to fade as he drove, becoming translucent, her voice echoing as if from a great distance, even though she was sitting right next to him. "You might make it," she called out, her voice growing fainter with each word. "You haven't been here long enough yet. The loop hasn't set its hooks in deep, hasn't wrapped itself around your consciousness the way it does after the first hour or two. But if you ever drive this road again, if you ever see the fog rolling down from the mountains like it did tonight, do everyone a favor. Turn around immediately. Take a different route, even if it adds hours to your trip. And if you see someone hitchhiking on this stretch, don't stop, no matter how desperate they look. They're not trying to get a ride out. They're trying to warn you. trying to save you before you become one of us, before you join the endless procession of cars driving the same 3 miles through eternity, through a November night that never ends, through a piece of Georgia that exists slightly outside reality, where time loops back on itself, and the fog never lifts, and the road never ends, and Jennifer Morrison and hundreds of others drive on forever, waiting for someone to finally understand, to finally believe, to finally break the cycle that began on a foggy night decades ago when someone made a wrong turn and the road decided never to let them leave. Marcus burst out of the fog bank doing 60 miles per hour in reverse, nearly colliding with a semi-truck on the normal stretch of highway, the truck's horn blaring as the driver swerved to avoid him. Marcus didn't care. He pulled onto the shoulder, breathing hard, his hands shaking on the wheel. His passenger seat was empty. No sign anyone had ever been there. But on the floor, where the woman's feet had been, was a driver's license, water-damaged and faded, the lamination peeling at the edges. The photo showed the hitchhiker, smiling brightly in a distinctly 1980s hairstyle with feathered bangs and excessive blue eyeshadow. The name read Jennifer Morrison. The issue date was June 1987. The expiration date was August 1991. A date that had never arrived for Jennifer. Marcus drove straight to the Cleveland Police Department, where he filed a detailed report with an officer who went progressively paler as Marcus told his story and handed over the license. The officer, a veteran of 25 years with the department, recognized the name immediately. Jennifer Morrison had been a missing person case since August 15, 1987, when she disappeared while driving from Gainesville to visit friends in Tennessee. Her car, a 1985 Honda Accord, had been found abandoned on Route 129 with no sign of Jennifer herself, no clues to her disappearance, no evidence of foul play. The case had gone cold decades ago, one of those frustrating mysteries that haunted investigators who couldn't provide closure to grieving families. But here's where the story takes its darkest and most inexplicable turn. The detail that makes this more than just another missing person case. The officer pulled up the complete case file on his computer and showed Marcus something that challenged everything he thought he understood about reality. Jennifer's car hadn't been found on Route 129 as Marcus had assumed. It had been discovered in her parents' garage in Athens, Georgia, over 150 miles away from where she was last seen, where witnesses had reported seeing her car on Route 129. The odometer showed over 200,000 miles of accumulated driving, even though Jennifer had only owned the vehicle for 6 months and had documented just 8,000 miles on it when she had last had it serviced, 2 weeks before her disappearance. And most disturbing of all, the gas tank, despite the engine being cold and the car clearly sitting unused for weeks, was exactly 3/4 full, the same level it had been at when Jennifer had stopped for gas on her way out of town that August day. Marcus never drove Route 129 again, taking elaborate detours that added hours to his trips rather than risk encountering that fog. But on foggy nights, particularly in November, he sometimes pulls up traffic camera footage from that stretch of highway, footage available through the Georgia Department of Transportation's public traffic monitoring system. And if you know where to look, if you zoom in carefully on the images captured between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m., you can see them. Cars driving in perfect loops, passing the same landmarks, their headlights cutting through fog that never quite clears. License plates from every decade since the 1980s, some of them so old the state has stopped issuing those particular designs. And sometimes, if the camera angle is just right, standing at the roadside with their thumbs out, figures in clothing from different eras, hoping the next driver will listen, will turn around, will escape before the loop closes around them, and they join the others in that endless, impossible drive through a November night that never ends. Through the same 3 miles that somehow contain infinity, through a piece of Georgia that exists slightly outside reality, where time loops back on itself, and the fog never lifts, and the road never ends, and Jennifer Morrison and hundreds of others drive on forever, waiting for someone to finally understand, to finally believe, to finally break the cycle that began on a foggy night decades ago when someone made a wrong turn and the road decided never to let them leave.
Savannah, Georgia, 2007. The Victorian house on East Jones Street was everything the Patterson family had dreamed of for years. 3 stories of historic Southern charm with intricate woodwork, original hardwood floors that gleamed under proper lighting, a sprawling garden featuring 200-year-old live oaks draped in Spanish moss, and most importantly, a price that seemed almost too good to be true for such a desirable location in Savannah's historic district. David and Claire Patterson, along with their 2 children, Noah and Hema, moved into their dream home during a sweltering June week, thrilled beyond measure to own a genuine piece of Savannah history. The real estate agent had been surprisingly forthcoming about the house's extensive past, which only added to its character in the Pattersons' eyes. Built in 1867 during Reconstruction, it had served various purposes over the decades: a prosperous family home, a boarding house during the Great Depression, and briefly in the 1950s, a private medical practice run by a doctor whose name had been mysteriously lost to time and incomplete records. The previous owners had lived there for only 8 months before relocating for work opportunities, or so the agent had claimed with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Everything was absolutely perfect for the first 3 weeks of their new life. The Pattersons threw an elaborate housewarming party, enrolled their children in excellent local schools, began making friends with neighbors, and started the exciting process of renovating and making the house truly their own. Then, on a particularly sweltering July afternoon, their 9-year-old son Noah came upstairs from the basement with a simple question that would unravel everything they thought they knew about their beautiful home. "Mom, why do we have a door in the basement with a lock on the inside instead of the outside?" Claire felt an immediate chill despite the oppressive heat as she followed Noah back down to the unfinished basement, which they'd been casually using for storage of boxes they hadn't yet unpacked. The space was deliberately left unfinished, with exposed brick walls showing their age, a poured concrete floor, and divided into several rooms that previous owners had used for various mundane purposes. Noah led her to the back corner, to a heavy wooden door she'd noticed during their initial walkthrough, but never really examined closely or thought to open. The door was constructed of solid wood, clearly very old, and indeed it had a substantial deadbolt installed on the interior side, the side that would be inside whatever room lay beyond. Claire stared at it, her mind racing through possible explanations. Maybe it was a wine cellar or root cellar, she suggested weakly, though even as the words left her mouth, she knew the explanation made no logical sense. Why would anyone need to lock a wine cellar from the inside? What possible purpose could that serve? She tried the exterior knob and found it locked solid. The door had no keyhole visible on the outside, just smooth, aged wood and the deadbolt mechanism visible through a small gap in the warped frame. That night, David examined the door with growing unease, using his contractor's eye for detail. The deadbolt was substantial and industrial grade, the kind normally used on exterior security doors, not interior basement rooms. And there were scratches around the bolt mechanism, deep gouges in the wood that looked disturbingly like they'd been made by human fingernails clawing desperately at the wood. When he pressed his ear against the door, he heard something that made him step back involuntarily. A faint rhythmic sound, almost like breathing, or perhaps wind moving through a tunnel, though there shouldn't be any air movement in a sealed room. "We should open it," he told Claire that evening over dinner, trying to sound casual despite his growing anxiety. "It's probably just old storage space, maybe an old colt chute or something equally mundane, but we should know what's in our own house, right?" The next morning, David spent nearly an hour drilling out the corroded deadbolt mechanism, which resisted his efforts as if it didn't want to be removed. When the bolt finally gave way with a metallic shriek, David pulled the door open slowly, and the smell that rushed out made him gag violently. Not the expected mustiness or decay, but something stale and clinical and medical, like a hospital room that had been hermetically sealed for decades.
The small room beyond, maybe 10 feet by 10 feet, had brick walls and no windows or ventilation. Against one wall stood a metal-framed bed with leather restraints still attached to the frame. A small medical table held instruments, old surgical tools, syringes, glass bottles with faded labels and archaic medical terminology. And covering every inch of the brick walls, written in what looked horrifyingly like dried blood, were words. Hundreds of desperate messages scratched and scrawled in a dozen different handwriting styles. "Let us out! Please, God, let us out! He's coming back! He always comes back!" Day 47. Still in the dark, still waiting for Mother. The doctor says we're getting better, but we never leave. We never leave." David stood frozen, his phone automatically capturing photographs, though he wasn't consciously aware of documenting the nightmare. Claire called the police immediately, her voice shaking, and within an hour, their beautiful home was swarming with officers and crime scene investigators, all wearing masks against the lingering smell. The investigation revealed a nightmare that had been sealed behind that door for over 50 years. In the 1950s, Dr. Aldrich Crane had run what he advertised as a progressive private treatment facility for patients with various mental health conditions. But Dr. Crane's methods went beyond even the barbaric standards of 1950s psychiatry. He'd kept patients in the basement room, sometimes for months, experimenting with treatments of his own design, telling their families they were showing improvement, while he slowly broke them down psychologically, extracting every penny he could before the inevitable deaths he would falsely attribute to their underlying conditions. Records show at least 7 patients had died under suspicious circumstances in Dr. Crane's care, though investigators suspected the real number was much higher. Dr. Crane himself had disappeared in 1958, his house sold by the bank after being abandoned. The locked room had simply been forgotten, hidden behind subsequent renovations until the Pattersons exposed it. But the story takes its darkest turn in what happened next. Despite everything, the Pattersons decided to stay. The police had removed all evidence, sealed the room, and assured them there was no ongoing danger. They lasted 4 more nights. On the first night, Emma woke screaming. A man in a white coat had been standing at her bed, writing in a notebook, asking questions about how she was feeling. On the second night, Claire heard footsteps in the basement, heavy boots pacing back and forth. The sealed door was warm to the touch, almost feverish. On the third night, they all heard voices from below, dozens of them, begging, asking for families, demanding to know why the doctor had left them in the dark. And on the fourth night, Noah disappeared. They found him at 3 a.m., standing before the sealed door, his hand on the wood, reciting in a flat monotone, "Patient exhibits signs of improvement. Continuing treatment regimen. Patient accepts this willingly. Patient wants to help the doctor." The Pattersons fled that night, taking only what they could carry, never returning. The house stands empty on East Jones Street, unsellable despite dropping prices. Neighbors report lights in the basement, voices, shadows moving. And sometimes, late at night, witnesses see a man in a white coat in the front window, writing in a notebook, waiting patiently for his next patient to arrive.